Okay, so let's close this out by talking a bit about the current kind of major thing in health, which is the COVID pandemic. And what do we know about it? What do we know about how gender shapes people's experiences with COVID? We're in a weird position where we simultaneously know a lot and very little. So we know a lot physiologically about what goes on with COVID, sociologically, how COVID shapes gender, how gender shapes COVID is becoming more and more clear, but is not entirely there yet. So I'll talk a little bit about that, and I'll give you some sort of conceptual tools or ways to think about, ways to imagine the way that gender shapes COVID. So the big story here is that in medical terms, the incidence of infection is roughly equal. So being a man is not going to protect you from COVID because of your manpower, what have you. Being a woman is not probably either. Being gender fluid or trans is not going to protect you. Um, but within that more or less roughly equal incidence of infections, men apparently have worse medical outcomes. This was more pronounced near the beginning of the pandemic, where the big metric was mortality or deaths, and men's appeared, well, didn't appear, it was the case. Um, Mortality for men was more of a danger than it was for women. Now, as we get more and more distance on it and we start learning more and more about the so-called long COVID or post-acute COVID or whatever you want to call it, the long haul experience of symptoms that persist a month, 6 months, maybe even 9 months after infection, that appears to be tilting towards women. Again, there's a reporting issue. Are women more likely to report that they're having issues with fatigue, they're having issues with breathing or headaches or pains or what have you than men are, or is it really actually happening more with women? Some information I've seen suggests that the sort of chronic day-to-day post-acute COVID or long-haul COVID phenomena tend to show up more in women, but the permanent damage to the heart, permanent damage to the circulatory system actually shows up a bit more in men, although often not found until after someone's died and upon examination, their heart, you know, appears to have sustained a lot of damage that someone of their age might typically not have experienced. So, you know, we don't really know just yet about how long-term COVID plays out. It does appear that in terms of psychological and social impacts of COVID, that while it's this is not fun for anybody, nobody's having a good time with this. It appears to have worse impacts on women. One way to think about this, and I'm just going to present you with this framework, because if I talked about all of these in detail, this lecture would be like 5 hours long. This is a framework that was developed during the last but one worldwide deadly pandemic, which was HIV/AIDS, for thinking about the different ways in which AIDS or HIV uh, shaped or touched people's lives depending on the type of contact they had with the virus. So the idea is that you could look at the most obvious group of people is the infected, people who test positive for the virus. That's the statistic that most people are familiar with. The infected overlap with the so-called afflicted. Those are the people that are severely ill. Those are the people that are in hospitals, that are sick. Their lives, they can't carry on a normal life with the virus. So not everybody who's infected is also afflicted. And in fact, because testing doesn't, roll out to and capture everybody, not everybody who's afflicted, this is particularly the case with AIDS, um, knows that they're infected. That actually the Venn diagram's a bit confusing here. Um, it's not that afflicted people are not infected. It is that depending on the virus, people may be sick with it without realizing that this is what's going on, that it's HIV or COVID, depending. But then there's a large group of people who are the affected, and these are people whose lives are altered or negatively impacted by the virus, whether or not they're infected, whether or not they are afflicted by sickness or illness. So, this affected group of people that are impacted by the virus is larger than infected or larger than afflicted and may overlap with them or may not. So, those three categories, if you want to look at how the virus is affecting people, that's a way to look at it. Early in the pandemic, there was some, I don't want to call it optimism because that's kind of a weird word in this context. Um, but there was a lot of talk about we're all in this together, we're all in the same boat. Whether you're rich or poor, COVID is a threat to you, which on one level was all true. On another level, though, was not at all true. So, uh, crises like COVID, huge population level events, can act as economic and social equalizers. And we've seen people who study pandemics in the past point to some of the great plagues in European history as events which, if you kind of overlook the fact that they killed millions of people, actually produced greater equality and in some cases greater solidarity within societies. COVID, however, is not panning out that way. It appears, rather than we're all in the same boat, it appears that some people's boats are leaking and taking on water a lot faster than other people's. COVID appears to be producing greater disadvantages for women than for men. And this is exacerbated when we intersect gender with being low income, lower economic status, and lower education. So, as we talked about in the previous part, we have some intersections and some interactions here, and COVID is proving to be worse overall for women than it is overall for men. Some of the ways in which COVID affected women, whether they're afflicted or infected themselves, include the following. Economic sectors that were severely affected by COVID, particularly shutting down early in the pandemic, and then this kind of COVID roller coaster, open, closed, thereafter, are sectors in which women predominate. And these include non-grocery retail, food service, fast food restaurants and so forth, hospitality that was kind of closed down almost completely, childcare. So women's occupations, women's work lives were more likely to be affected than men's, which is not to say that men were not severely and negatively affected, but that the sectors which were most disrupted by COVID are also sectors in which women workers predominate. Somewhat paradoxically, women workers also predominate in sectors that were declared essential and were kept open, albeit at significant risk and and stress and danger. And these include healthcare, the not so much doctors, but healthcare workers, nurses, community-based healthcare workers, and so forth. Women predominate. And in grocery retail is kind of the shorthand, essential retail operations that were kept open. again, public-facing positions, women predominate. So women were exposed to many of the stresses that go with being frontline workers at the same time as women also predominated in the group whose livelihoods were most disrupted. And finally, women also, we know from time use studies, took up more of the unpaid work in homes and communities that was generated by COVID, particularly when schools were closed, than men did. So women's total hours of work, paid and unpaid, um, went up, or that's not quite the right way to say it. The burden on women, if you combine unpaid and paid work, was increased by COVID more than the burden on men was increased. And a big chunk of that was this sort of invisible work that occurred within homes when other things shut down. And so everything, kind of came home, all the meals and all the child care and all the sort of emotional labor and stuff all came home, tended to fall on women. Um, women's job loss, I mean, we'll be, figuring this out for ages to come. But even at the beginning of the pandemic, women's job losses exceeded those of men by a really remarkable amount. So in the first couple of months of the pandemic, actually 70% of all the jobs that disappeared were not just women's jobs, but women in that sort of prime decades for earning, the young adulthood, early middle age, that made up 70% of job losses. For women who were able to keep their jobs, their decreases in hours of employment, sometimes tipping from full-time employment into part-time, was more pronounced for women than for men. So that whereas on average, at the beginning of the pandemic, men's hours of employment for men that remained employed declined. For women, they declined more. So the economic hit in reduction in work hours was more pronounced for women than for men. And this is largely because women predominated in service sectors, public facing sectors where there's a lot of shift work. So shifts getting canceled, because the restaurant's closed or because you're working, let's say, as a hotel cleaner, and that's, your services are no longer needed. That's going to translate to more hours lost for women than for men who were relatively protected from that. I don't mean to say that men just sort of sailed through the COVID pandemic, because that's not at all the case, but women certainly took more of a hit. When intersected with parenting status, a person with, if you take a person with children, if that person is a mother, they, on average, experienced more of a cutback in their working hours and their employment than if that was a male person with children. And that largely is due to the increased demands of childcare in the home, which by and large men were not picking up. We're letting that fall to female partners. So this was an economic hit that had more impact for women with kids than it did for men with kids. The gap between mothers and fathers in terms of employment during the pandemic was also intersected with income and education. So mothers who were working in low-income sectors of the economy or had only a high school education, which is a pretty good proxy for economic status, the gender gap there between them and their male partners, if a male partner was present, was greater than for women who reported higher incomes or higher levels of education. And whether that's, uh, me back that up again. One of the explanations that's been given for this is that women with higher levels of education, who are in more highly skilled, highly paid jobs, were more able to flex their jobs, their work hours, rather than giving them up entirely. So imagine if you're, let's say your job is writing textbooks, you may be able to work from home. Maybe you can't do as many hours as you did when you were working in an office, but you can move your job around a little bit. You can flex it a bit in a way that you can't if your job was being a clerk in a dollar store. You can't run the cash for a dollar store at home, while your kids are running around. So the only thing to do is to either let the kids run wild unsupervised if your store is still open, um, or give up that store job entirely. So the greater ability of women in kind of white collar, more highly paid professional positions to exercise a bit of flexibility and hang on to their jobs may explain why they fared a little bit better than women who did not have higher status, more highly skilled, professionalized jobs. When it comes to mental health, perhaps not surprising, given all the economic stresses on women in the midst of this global health crisis. Almost all the research that's coming in suggests that women report higher levels of stress and anxiety. They also report sharper increases in their level of stress and anxiety, um, as compared to men. So not only was there an absolute difference, there's a difference over time in the rate at which these symptoms of mental and physical distress are increasing and piling up. Women were more likely than men to describe their lives as quite a bit or extremely stressful. This is, on the one hand, this is kind of not news because most well-being surveys, particularly of people in their um, uh, young adult, middle age years, find that women are more likely to say their lives are stressful. But the gender gap opened up further during the pandemic. So the negative impact on women's reported levels of well being seems to have been greater than it was on men's, even though, it was pretty negative for everybody. Women were also more likely to report that they were very concerned or extremely concerned about basically everything to do with COVID, like globally. No matter how the question was asked, are you worried about your own health? Are you worried about your family's health? Are you worried about the health of vulnerable family members or people in the community? Are you worried about what's happening kind of globally in the world? Women were consistently registering higher levels of concern and anxiety about almost every facet of the pandemic than men were. Is that because women are consuming more kind of pandemic oriented information or media or news than men are? Is it because they perceive themselves as being responsible for ameliorating some of these impacts? Are they seeing things, you know, affecting them directly more than men are? It's not clear, but certainly there's a gender difference in terms of COVID related stress and anxiety. The implications for this as time wears on, here are a few of them. One is that we'll probably continue to see a shift in terms of the burden of caregiving work. So, schools, childcare centers, when these institutions are either closed or they're open and closed your kids there and then they're home for 2 weeks and then they're back in school again and so forth. We're seeing caregiving work, particularly with children, moving from the paid economy, where women typically do it, but they get paid for it, to the unpaid economy, back in the home, where, again, men have not been picking up this caregiving work. Women are doing it, but they're not getting paid for it. So care work, particularly for children, is being reorganized. Managing COVID for the home, just kind of getting through a pandemic home, often requires or appears to be requiring a burden of time, a burden of additional work, which does not fall equally on men and women. So in the early months when people thought they had to clean and sanitize everything constantly, there's that. Shopping, provisioning may become a whole different thing in terms of time and also in terms of stress. Homeschooling, providing care for people who become sick, all those are gendered issues, concerns. We may see some kind of bleed over from the stresses that affect men in terms of their own COVID related job losses and precarity, that may add to or exacerbate the uh, mental health and well being burdens that women are holding. And so, overall, in terms of gender, COVID's beginning to look like a bit of it's a disaster for everyone. It's a gender disaster, particularly for women. And, we'll see how it plays out. We probably won't know for years what the long-term gendered implications of COVID will be. It's a moving target, and we'll continue to watch and see what happens. Okay, and that's it for this week. I will see you next week.